Hello ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to be going back and adding a few amendments to my Guild Wars 2 versus Final Fantasy XIV video, as there were some aspects about Guild Wars that I either got completely incorrect, misunderstood, or just didn't go into enough detail of. This is an apology to the Guild Wars 2 community for those mistakes, and before I begin, I would like to say a massive thank you to everyone who commented what I got wrong in both a respectful and considered way. It took a lot of time to watch the video, even more to write a comment on it, and I do genuinely appreciate that time taken. So not to waste even more of it, I'll let you know now that the video bit of this response is just gameplay, so you may want to just have this one in the background. To begin in earnest, I'll start by looking at one of the most egregious errors in the Holy Trinity, as originally I stated that it wasn't really a thing, which is straight up completely false. While it's not as clearly defined as World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy XIV, there are dedicated builds and styles for those roles, which are required if you're going to raid or do any other high-end content. These builds, done through the specialization system, even allow what would normally be considered non-traditional classes to fulfill these roles, like the Mesmerer cloth-wearing illusion mage being able to tank with the Chronomancer elite spec, or the warrior going full support mode with a dedicated banner build. While I rightly praised the build system, upon reflection I clearly missed just how impressively people could craft their classes towards certain roles. These roles as well are an interesting side note, as having looked into raiding a bit more, the complexity of actually creating a raid team is really interesting. Having to form a group in such a way to cover a lot of the buffs and debuffs required to go into raid seems incredibly difficult, so I severely underestimated the complexity of Guild Wars 2 endgame. And speaking of that endgame, however, there was also a lot I missed on that front. I originally made the point that they didn't really add any new dungeons in some of the new expansions, which, while true, I'd completely missed the fractal system, which makes up for it. These serve as endgame evolution of running dungeons with upwards of 100 levels, instabilities which are kind of like affixes from World of Warcraft Mythics, and its own internal progression system with agony resistance. Alongside their own stories and environments, these truly do make up for the lack of other dungeons. Another PvE endgame activity I also missed is the far more recent strikes and dragon response missions that came alongside the Icebrood Saga living story. The dragon response missions are effectively mini dungeons in themselves, with a fairly self-contained story that fits into the overarching narrative of the Icebrood Saga, and the strikes themselves are self-contained bosses similar to Final Fantasy XIV Trials. While less complicated than raid bosses themselves, they are an excellent stepping stone into that kind of endgame if you wanted to pursue it. Although, speaking of content more broadly, one big thing that a lot of people brought up was my emphasis on combat as the major part of Guild Wars 2. This is a point where I think I miscommunicated my argument, as people are 100% correct that there's a lot more to do to the game than just combat. Tons of jumping puzzles which are very difficult, a lot of collectible hunting you can do, tons of guild activities which are non-violent, such as find 10 locations based on hints. You've got fishing now, fashion wars, and a story which I find incredibly underrated when people discuss gaming narratives. And all of these are valid things to do outside of combat. The point I was attempting to make, which I did so poorly, wasn't that Guild Wars 2 is always combat all the time, but that there was noticeably more combat involved than there is in Final Fantasy XIV, which is something I still stand by. In retrospect, I should have dedicated an entire section to comparing each of these games on their non-combat areas to really highlight what Guild Wars 2 has to offer. To return to the endgame a little bit more, another thing I didn't fully grasp was the gearing system. I originally pointed to expensive crafting, long-term laurel investment, and getting absurdly lucky in certain events as the main ways to get ascended gear, which isn't entirely true. This kind of gear also drops from raids and fractals, which upon further review seems like the far better method of gear acquisition if you have the guild for it. And so before I close, there are 4 more minor points I'd like to bring up that I found throughout the comments of the last video. The first is that ArenaNet is looking to enhance the new player experience in preparation for their eventual launch onto Steam, so many of my points regarding their intrinsic retention-focused nature of development may soon be turned around depending on how aggressively they push the Steam launch or how extensively they change how people get into the game. While I can't comment more on that, as we don't know any of the specifics, it's worth a mention that the new game experience isn't completely forgotten. Secondly, a few people made the point when comparing the two on a business level that the budget for Final Fantasy XIV was far more extensive than Guild Wars 2, which is correct. Like I mentioned, ArenaNet only has Guild Wars 2, while Final Fantasy XIV has all of Square Enix backing it, which has since dropped a lot of money into it before Endwalker. So the difference in the amount of content and the ability to actually rework it does have a financial element to it, which was certainly something that would have been worth mentioning in the initial review. Thirdly, on a story front, I should have specified that when you log in, when the New World story comes out, that you do get it for free. You only ever need to buy it if you weren't around for them, and even if that's the case, ArenaNet pretty frequently runs Return to X story events where you can get them for free again. That may be a while in the future yet, now that they're doing Living Season 1 again, which is an excellent decision on their part, by the way, but still, it's another thing I should have specified a little bit more. Then lastly, I did forget to mention when discussing the gem store that it is possible to buy gems for gold. While I was too focused on the idea that you could straight up buy money for money, it wasn't fair of me to mention the reverse, and that with enough grinding or smart gold making, you'd be able to basically buy anything in the cash shop without spending actual cash. I'd like to reiterate my apologies for all of these mistakes. Just because I hadn't encountered a lot of these things in-game didn't mean they didn't exist, and without proper research, I unfairly judged the game in many aspects. This has been one hell of an experience with a lot of lessons learned, which I can promise you will be well and truly on display the next time I release a major review or comparison video on any topic, not just Guild Wars 2. To those who took the time to watch the other video and comment, I want to again thank you. This amendment video was a long time coming. It should have been a lot more prompt, and hopefully is the only time I ever have to make one of these again. If there's anything you feel like I missed, please feel free to bring it up in the comments on my Discord or one of my Twitch streams. I'm always interested in getting more feedback and learning from the community, as there's always someone who knows more about basically anything than I do. Until then, however, thank you for taking the time to listen, and I hope you have an excellent day.